I was never a man who thought much about the word old. It always sounded like a faraway bell tolling for someone else, a signal that belonged to my neighbors, or to strangers in the obituary pages of the local paper, not to me. For years I carried myself with the pride of someone who had worked hard, paid his bills, raised a family, and expected nothing but the simple dignity of being left to live his days in peace. My name is Henry Clayton, and at 76 years of age, I still wake up before dawn, because my body has been trained by decades of early mornings at the hardware store where I worked most of my life. The store is long gone now, sold to a national chain that has no need for men with arthritic hands and a memory full of screws and fittings. But my body does not forget its habits. I wake at 5, sit slowly up in bed, and reach for the small lamp on the nightstand that belonged to my wife, Margaret. She passed 9 years ago, yet I still keep her lamp burning every morning, as if she were just in the kitchen preparing coffee. Sometimes when the light flickers, I almost believe she is. The house we bought together in 1972 still stands, though it has begun to sag and creak like an old ship moored too long at the dock. The roof tiles curl, the paint on the porch rail is cracked, and the garden that once bloomed under Margaret's careful hands has grown into a wild mix of roses and weeds. I tend to it as best I can, pruning carefully with my stiff fingers, telling myself that she would be pleased, though I know she would laugh at my clumsy efforts. In the mornings, I shuffle down the narrow hallway with its faded family pictures, Margaret holding our baby daughter Claire, myself in a suit that no longer fits, a summer picnic where Claire's hair is braided in ribbons. I sometimes pause in front of those frames and whisper an apology to the glass for not being able to hold on to the family the way Margaret believed I could. My days now are quiet, shaped by routines that seem fragile, yet comforting. I grind coffee beans slowly, measuring carefully, as if that act alone gives structure to the hours. I open the newspaper, though my eyes blur, and I have to hold it close, and I circle crossword clues I never finish. On Tuesdays, I walk to the corner store for milk and bread, leaning on the oak cane I carved myself 20 years ago when my knees first began to betray me. On Fridays, I sit on the porch and watch the children of the neighborhood ride bicycles down the street, their laughter echoing through the evening. I tell myself that if I squint hard enough, I can almost see Claire at that age again, her legs pumping furiously on a bright red Schwinn we bought secondhand, her face filled with the simple joy of freedom. Those memories keep me company more than she does these days. Claire has her own life, as she reminds me often in the clipped tones of someone with little patience for sentiment. She is 50 now, a successful real estate agent, always dressed sharply, her phone buzzing with clients and deals. She lives only 20 minutes away but treats the distance as if it were an ocean. When she calls, it is usually to ask about money, sometimes for help with property taxes, sometimes for her children's tuition, sometimes just to smooth over whatever bills she and her husband have neglected. I have rarely said no, not because I am wealthy, but because Margaret raised me to believe that a father's duty is to provide until his last breath. Yet each time I write a check or withdraw cash, I feel something inside me shrinking, a sense that I am being reduced to a wallet with a pulse, rather than a man whose love once built the foundation of her life. I used to think that with age would come a certain reverence, that my daughter would look at me and see not just a bent spine and thinning hair, but the decades of sacrifice and work that allowed her to climb into the position she holds now. Instead, she treats me like an obligation, a chore that must be completed between sales calls. When she does visit, she surveys the house like an appraiser rather than a daughter, noting how much the property might sell for if it were renovated, suggesting I should move into a retirement facility for my own safety. I nod, smile faintly, and hide the sting of those words, but when she drives away, leaving only the smell of her expensive perfume in the hallway, I sit in Margaret's old armchair and wonder how love between parent and child can thin into such cold practicality. There are moments, of course, when I convince myself she still cares. She brings her children occasionally, though more often they are sullen, absorbed in their phones, barely acknowledging me. I try to ask them about school, about friends, about music, but their answers are short, and Claire interrupts as if embarrassed by my interest. Once, when her son left his jacket behind, I folded it carefully and placed it in the closet, hoping he might return soon. It hung there for months until Claire stopped by, grabbed it without thanks, and left again. The emptiness of the closet after that small departure felt heavier than I can explain. As the seasons roll by, I find myself retreating more into memory. Margaret's laughter when we danced clumsily in the kitchen, the smell of apple pies cooling on the windowsill, the warmth of summer evenings when Claire ran barefoot through the yard, those memories sustain me more than the present does. The present feels like a waiting room with no clear appointment, just endless hours of silence punctuated by the occasional ring of a phone asking for money. I still cling to dignity, keeping my clothes neat, polishing my shoes even if no one will see them, mowing the lawn slowly despite my aching knees, because I fear that if I surrender to neglect, I will confirm what my daughter already seems to believe, that I am fading, irrelevant, burdensome. Sometimes I test myself by walking farther than I should, forcing my legs to carry me down the longer path to the park. I sit on a bench there, watching young couples push strollers, listening to conversations that drift past. I imagine Margaret beside me, her hand warm on mine, telling me not to be so hard on Claire, that life has made her sharp, not cruel, that perhaps under her polished surface she still loves me. I try to believe it. But each time I return home to the silence of my kitchen, that belief crumbles like brittle paper. The truth is that my daughter rarely asks about my health, never about my loneliness, and when she does look at me, her eyes measure my decline rather than my worth. So this is where I begin. An old man with a stubborn heart, living in a house filled with echoes, clinging to memories as if they were rope in a storm. I still stand tall when I can. I still shave carefully each morning. I still set Margaret's lamp aglow before I make my coffee. Yet beneath these rituals lies a current of sadness that grows heavier with each passing year. I have learned to endure the loneliness, to swallow the disappointments, to answer her clipped phone calls with polite restraint. But I never imagined that the daughter I once carried on my shoulders, whose scraped knees I kissed, whose bedtime stories I told with voices that made her laugh until she fell asleep in my arms, would one day look at me, not with love or even respect, but with calculation, with impatience, with something dangerously close to contempt. And though I've long suspected it in the private corners of my mind, I was not prepared for the day when her words would strip away the last illusion and leave me staring at the truth of what I have become in her eyes. Not a father, not a man, but simply an old body waiting to stumble. It was in late spring, one of those Sundays when the air smells faintly of lilacs, and the sun lingers kindly on the streets, when my daughter surprised me with a visit that seemed almost casual, though in my heart I knew there was a purpose behind it. I had just finished trimming the bushes in the front yard, sweat dampening my shirt despite the mild weather, when her car pulled up to the curb, polished and shining as though it had just rolled out of the showroom. Claire stepped out with the confident stride of a woman who knows the world bends a little in her direction. Her phone clutched in one hand, sunglasses perched on her head, her husband following behind with the same distracted look he always carried, as if being in my presence were a temporary inconvenience before something more important. For a fleeting moment I felt a lift in my chest, the foolish hope that perhaps they had simply come to share a Sunday meal, to sit at the old table where Margaret once served roast chicken and apple pie, to remember that beneath the years and the distance we were still family. But that illusion was quickly tested when Claire announced, without preamble, that they thought it would be nice for me to join them on a walk through the city park. She said it in that brisk way of hers, half invitation and half command, as though she had already scheduled the outing in her calendar and was simply informing me of my role. I hesitated, brushing dirt from my hands, unsure if my knees would carry me as far as the park paths. But something in her tone made it impossible to refuse. I told myself that perhaps this was her attempt at reconciliation, that maybe she wanted her children to see their grandfather outside the dim kitchen where they usually sat staring at their phones. So I nodded, went inside to change into my cleanest shirt, and tried to ignore the flicker of anxiety that ran through me at the thought of keeping pace with their long strides. I took my cane, though I resented the need for it, and when I returned to the porch, they were waiting impatiently, the engine of the car still running as though even these few minutes of preparation were more than they had allotted for me. The drive was short but tense. Claire chatted about the housing market, throwing out numbers and terms that meant little to me, while her husband grunted in agreement, and I sat in the back seat like an afterthought, watching familiar streets roll by, wondering when conversation between us had become so cold and functional. When we arrived at the park, the parking lot was already full, families unloading picnic baskets, children chasing each other with kites, young couples holding hands. For a moment, as I stepped out of the car, I was struck by the sheer brightness of it all. The laughter carried on the breeze, the sight of blooming trees arching over the walkways, and I thought perhaps this was not such a bad idea after all. We began to walk, Claire leading with quick strides, her husband beside her, their children trailing with earbuds tucked discreetly into their ears. I followed behind, a few paces slower, my cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement, my body aching with each incline. At first it was pleasant enough, the sun warm on my shoulders, the scent of grass and flowers mixing in the air. But soon I noticed the way Claire glanced back at me, not with affection or even concern, but with irritation, as though my slower pace were an inconvenience to her carefully planned afternoon. She whispered something to her husband, and he chuckled. And though I could not make out the words, the sound lodged in me like a thorn. We paused at a fountain where children tossed coins into the water, their parents smiling indulgently, and I reached into my pocket for a dime, thinking I might offer it to my granddaughter as a small gesture. But she shook her head without looking up from her phone, muttering that she did not believe in wishes. And Claire rolled her eyes as though I had done something foolish. It was a tiny moment, easily dismissed, yet it stung more than I cared to admit, because it reminded me of all the times I had once pressed coins into Claire's hand when she was little, urging her to make wishes, to believe in something beyond the ordinary. As we continued walking, my steps grew heavier, but I forced myself onward, unwilling to show weakness, determined to prove that I still belonged in their company. The path curved upward toward a small hill that overlooked the lake, and I felt the strain in my knees sharpen, but I gritted my teeth and kept going. It was then, as we climbed, that I caught a clearer fragment of their hushed conversation. Claire had leaned toward her husband, her voice low but sharp, and I heard her say, "Just let him manage on his own. If he stumbles, well, he's old. It's bound to happen sooner or later." The words reached me like a sudden gust of cold wind. For a second I thought I had misheard, that the rustle of leaves had twisted her sentence, but the smirk on her husband's face confirmed it. They had spoken of me not as a father or even as a person, but as a fragile inconvenience, a body expected to falter, a spectacle to be endured. My grip tightened on the cane, my breath caught, and for several steps I could only focus on the sound of my own heartbeat drumming in my ears. I did not stumble then, though the ground seemed to sway beneath me, but something inside me shifted irreversibly. I forced a smile when Claire glanced back, though my chest ached with the effort, and I nodded as if to assure her I was fine, though in truth I felt anything but fine. I kept walking, step after painful step, determined not to give her the satisfaction of seeing me falter. The sunlight that had seemed so bright only minutes earlier now felt harsh exposing, and every laugh of the children playing nearby seemed to mock me. I told myself to stay calm, to endure, that perhaps she had not meant it as it sounded, but deep down I knew there was no mistake. Those words were the unfiltered truth, spoken when she believed I was too far behind to hear. That Sunday walk, which I had allowed myself to imagine as a chance to reconnect, became instead the moment when the fragile illusion of family cracked in two. It was not just that my daughter saw me as old, it was that she seemed to wish me to stumble, to prove myself frail, to confirm the story she had already written about me. And though I kept moving, though I smiled when they posed for pictures by the lake, though I even forced a laugh when her husband pointed out a jogger tripping on the path ahead, inside me something had already broken. That afternoon, beneath the bright sky of spring, I realized I was no longer simply an aging father trying to stay part of his daughter's life. I was a man standing on the edge of betrayal, about to discover just how far she had drifted from love, and how far I might be forced to go to reclaim the dignity she had begun to strip from me. The words I overheard that afternoon in the park did not leave me quickly. They clung to me like a stubborn shadow, replaying themselves in my mind with every step I took, until it seemed that each tap of my cane on the pavement echoed the phrase my daughter had uttered with such careless cruelty. If he stumbles, well, he's old. It was not merely the words themselves that wounded me, but the casual tone in which they were delivered, the way she did not even lower her voice enough to conceal them from the possibility of being overheard, the way her husband smirked as though this was an inside joke they had shared many times before, something repeated with enough regularity that it had lost its sting for them and gained only humor. For me, it was not humorous at all. It was the unveiling of a truth I had been denying for years, that my daughter did not see me as her father anymore, but as an aging burden, whose inevitable decline was a matter of observation, even anticipation. We continued along the path toward the lake, where ducks swam lazily and children tossed breadcrumbs into the water, and I tried to focus on the ordinary sights of Sunday leisure, but my mind was too clouded. When my granddaughter tugged at her mother's sleeve, asking for money to buy ice cream, I instinctively reached for my wallet, eager to provide the simple treat, a small chance to play the role of doting grandfather. But before I could speak, Claire snapped, "Don't bother, Dad, I've got it," and pulled a bill from her purse with the air of a woman intercepting an unsteady hand. The girl did not even glance at me as she trotted away toward the vendor, and I was left standing with my wallet half open, my gesture dismissed before it had even been completed. My daughter's tone had been sharp, almost offensive, as though she feared I might embarrass her with my generosity, as though my offering of a few dollars was somehow shameful. I felt my hand tremble as I returned the wallet to my pocket, not from weakness, but from anger that I was being treated like a man who could no longer be trusted to make even the smallest gesture of kindness without supervision. Later, when we stopped at a shaded bench to rest, I lowered myself carefully onto the wooden slats, grateful for the chance to ease the pressure on my knees. My son-in-law sat beside me, scrolling on his phone, not bothering to disguise his disinterest. Claire stood a few feet away, speaking animatedly into her Bluetooth headset, her arms gesturing with the energy of someone closing a deal. I listened to her voice carry on about square footage, mortgage rates, and investment returns, and it struck me how foreign her language had become, how little space it left for words like father or family. When she finished the call, she turned to me with a smile that was too bright, too professional, and asked, "Are you all right sitting there, Dad? We don't want you to overdo it." Her voice was polite on the surface, but I heard the edge beneath it, the suggestion that I was slowing them down. I assured her I was fine, though in truth my legs ached terribly, and I clenched my jaw against the pain because I could not bear to give her the satisfaction of being proven right. As we resumed walking, the humiliation deepened. At one point the path narrowed and became uneven, roots jutting through the soil, and my cane caught against one of them, making me stagger slightly. Immediately Claire's hand darted toward her husband, not to help me, but to draw his attention, and I saw the flash of amusement in her eyes, as if to say, "See, I told you?" He chuckled under his breath, and though the stumble had been minor, I felt as though I had been stripped naked before them, my weakness displayed like a spectacle. I righted myself quickly, forcing my stride to steady, but inside I burned with shame. That shame did not come from the stumble itself, for after all, anyone can trip on a root, but from the knowledge that my daughter had been waiting for it, watching for it, almost willing it to happen, and that when it finally did, she found in it not concern but vindication. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a series of small humiliations, strung together by the thin thread of pretense. At the Lakeside Cafe, they insisted on ordering for me, choosing a bland sandwich rather than letting me pick from the menu, explaining to the waiter in a condescending tone that Dad can't handle spicy food anymore. When I attempted to protest, Claire brushed my words aside with a brisk, "Trust me, it's for your own good." I sat quietly then, chewing each tasteless bite, feeling less like a man at lunch with his family and more like a patient in some supervised outing from a nursing home. Even the children, emboldened perhaps by their mother's example, treated me with a kind of dismissive amusement. My grandson asked loudly, "Do you even know how to use TikTok, Grandpa?" And when I admitted I did not, he laughed with the cruel confidence of youth and muttered, "Figures." Claire did not correct him. She laughed as well, shaking her head as though my ignorance were something expected and faintly ridiculous. When the walk finally ended and we returned to the car, I felt drained in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. My body ached, yes, but it was my spirit that felt most bruised. Sitting in the back seat again, I stared out the window at the blur of passing houses, my own reflection faint in the glass, and wondered when exactly I had become an object of mockery in my daughter's eyes. Margaret would never have allowed this, I thought, and the absence of her protective presence cut me deeply in that moment. I remembered how she used to defend me fiercely, how she once told Claire when she was still a teenager that respect for one's father was not optional, that it was the foundation of character. Now Margaret was gone, and with her had vanished the last barrier that might have kept our daughter from hardening into the person she had become. That night, after they dropped me home with a perfunctory wave, I sat alone in my kitchen with the lamp burning, staring at the cold cup of tea before me. The house was silent except for the ticking of the clock, and in that silence I replayed the day again and again. Every laugh, every dismissive word, every condescending smile. It struck me that what I had experienced was not merely thoughtless behavior, but a pattern of contempt, a deliberate stripping away of my dignity piece by piece. Claire no longer saw me as the man who raised her. She saw me as a living burden, a fragile body whose eventual collapse would be both inevitable and, perhaps in her secret thoughts, convenient. That realization cut deeper than any stumble could, for it meant that the bond I had spent my life nurturing had been replaced by something colder, harsher, and irreversible. I sat there until the clock struck midnight, the lamp flickering weakly, and I whispered into the empty room a question that had no answer. How had love between a father and daughter turned into this theater of humiliation? The day in the park had been meant, at least in my hopeful imagination, as a chance to feel included again, to walk beside them, as part of their lives. Instead, it had become a stage on which my frailty was observed, measured, and quietly ridiculed. And though I had kept my footing, though I had not fallen, I understood with a clarity that chilled me that this was only the beginning, the first escalation of a conflict I had never wanted but would no longer be able to avoid. A week after that uneasy Sunday in the park, when the memory of Claire's whispered cruelty still gnawed at me like a stone pressing against the inside of my chest, she called again, her voice brisk and decisive as always, as though our last outing had been a success worth repeating. She proposed another family gathering, this time a walk along the riverfront downtown followed by dinner at a new restaurant she wanted to try. I hesitated, the silence stretching on the line, but her tone left little room for refusal. She spoke as though she were arranging an appointment, not inviting her father, and before I could form an excuse, she had already declared the time and place, her words clipped and final, and hung up before I could say much more than a weary, "all right?" When the day came, I tried to prepare myself, polishing my shoes, putting on my best jacket, combing my thinning hair with more care than usual, convincing myself that if I presented an image of steadiness, perhaps I would be treated differently. The riverfront was crowded, the air filled with the mingled scents of food trucks and the chatter of tourists, and I struggled to keep pace as we moved along the walkway. Claire's children darted ahead, laughing with the boundless energy of youth, while she and her husband followed at a measured distance, speaking in low voices. I trailed a few steps behind, determined not to lag too far, but the uneven paving stones made my knees ache, and I had to concentrate on every placement of my cane. It was in the middle of this bustling path, surrounded by strangers and noise, that I heard the words that shifted everything inside me. Claire, walking just ahead, turned slightly to her husband and muttered in a voice she thought private, "If he trips, just let him. He needs to realize he can't keep going like this." Her husband laughed softly, the sound muffled but unmistakable, and then she added something that struck me like a blow to the ribs. "He's old. He has to learn his limits." I stopped walking for a moment, letting the crowd flow around me, my hand gripping the cane so tightly my knuckles whitened. The world blurred, the laughter of strangers distant and hollow, as her words echoed through me with cruel precision. This was no longer a careless comment, no longer an idle whisper. This was intent. My daughter was not simply observing my frailty, she was willing it into existence, instructing those around her not to intervene should I fall. It was as if she were standing on the edge of a stage, waiting for the curtain to rise on the spectacle of her father's collapse. I resumed walking, slower now, each step heavy, but I kept my head high, refusing to let my shoulders stoop beneath the weight of her disdain. I could not confront her there, not in the middle of the riverfront, with her children skipping ahead and the crowd pressing in around us, but something inside me hardened irrevocably. I realized with an almost physical clarity that I had been living in an illusion, convincing myself that her coldness was circumstantial, that her requests for money were born of necessity, that her dismissiveness was just the impatience of modern life. But those whispers revealed the truth. She did not want to help me stand. She wanted to watch me stumble. She wanted my weakness to be undeniable, to justify the distance she had already placed between us, to confirm to herself, and perhaps to others, that I was no longer a man to be regarded, but a relic to be tolerated until he finally fell for good. Later, at the restaurant, the humiliation deepened in subtler ways. Claire ordered for me without asking, selecting a soft dish of steamed fish as though I were a child, incapable of making choices. She laughed with her husband about my old-fashioned tastes. When I asked for a glass of red wine, dismissing me with the wave of her manicured hand. Her children snickered openly when I struggled to hear the waiter in the noisy room, repeating my order louder than necessary as though I were deaf. I sat there in the dim light, surrounded by laughter that excluded me, and realized that the man they saw was not the father who had worked long hours to keep a roof over their heads, not the man who once carried Claire on his shoulders through county fairs, not the husband who built a life beside Margaret. In their eyes, I had already been reduced to nothing more than an old man whose eventual fall would be both confirmation and conclusion. That night, returning home alone, I stood for a long time in front of the mirror above the bathroom sink, studying the face that stared back at me. The deep lines around my mouth, the sagging skin beneath my eyes, the thin white hair. I had always known they were there, but now I saw them, not through my own eyes, but through hers. I imagined her smirk when she whispered those words, the satisfaction in her tone, and I realized that to her this face represented not history, not sacrifice, not love, but liability. She wanted me to accept defeat, to fold into the role of the helpless elder who could be sidelined, managed, and ultimately discarded. But as I looked into my own eyes in that mirror, something stirred in me that I had not felt in years. Defiance. The knowledge that my daughter no longer wished me to stand was the very thing that steeled my resolve to do so. I was tired of bending, tired of excusing her coldness, tired of handing over pieces of my dignity like coins into an endless purse. For the first time I saw clearly that I would need to protect myself not just from the cruelty of strangers, but from the betrayal of my own blood. And though my hands trembled as I turned off the light, it was not from weakness this time, but from the awareness that I had reached a turning point. There would be no going back to illusions. There would only be the truth, and what I chose to do with it. The weeks that followed that dinner along the riverfront unspooled with the slow certainty of a rope fraying strand by strand, and I learned, in the way a man learns late truths about his own house, to spot the hairline cracks that had been there all along, only now they widened under the slightest pressure and let in drafts I could no longer ignore. Claire began calling more often, which would have seemed like progress to anyone who did not know her cadence. The calls arrived with the same clipped brightness as a sales pitch, questions wrapped around little commands, and beneath them the dull thud of inevitability. She had, she said, been researching options and wanted to take me to a place that could really support me, which I recognized as code for touring a facility where I would be handled by strangers with gentle voices and rubber-soled shoes. When I told her that I still managed my mornings, my meals, my medications, and my bills, she paused only long enough to make her counter-offer sound merciful. She would arrange a routine cognitive screening. Nothing binding, a simple test to make. Sure, I was safe. It was the word safe that made my jaw clench, because in my daughter's mouth it no longer meant protected, it meant contained. I agreed to the doctor's visit in the way a man agrees to let a storm blow through, hoping it will spend itself on the empty fields rather than his roof. And when the day came, she drove me across town as if she were doing me a favor, chattering about market inventory and interest rates, while her husband scrolled through his email with the glassy stare of someone who has learned how to be present without being there. The nurse who checked me in had kind eyes and a practiced smile, the kind that respects elders because the job requires it, and the doctor ran me through questions I answered carefully, but without fear. I remembered the date and the season, and the name of the president I counted backward by sevens. I recalled 3 random words after a few minutes had passed, and when he asked me to draw a clock, I sketched the circle steady enough that my own surprise warmed me. He concluded, politely and without hesitation, that I was age-appropriate cognitively, with no acute signs of impairment, and I watched the subtle change in Claire's mouth as she absorbed the verdict. It was not disappointment exactly, but a recalibration, the way a card player shifts his weight when a trick does not fall the way he predicted. On the drive home, she wore her sunglasses despite the overcast sky and said that of course she had never doubted me, she only wanted to gather information. You can't be too careful these days. And I nodded, because it was easier than pointing out that a daughter who whispers, "Let him trip," is not careful at all. She is only rehearsing a fall she wants to see. After that, she tried a different angle, arriving on a Tuesday with a folder of papers and a silver pen that clicked like a metronome for the tempo of my surrender. She called it a pharmacy authorization. Just a convenience, she said, so she could pick up my prescriptions if I were tired, or the weather were bad, and I could sign it now while she was here. It would take a second. I told her to leave it with me and I would read it after supper. And that small resistance changed the light in her eyes from cloudy patience to a colder shine. She insisted it was nothing. Barely a paragraph, really. And I thanked her again and repeated myself, because I had been a hardware man long enough to know that what seems like a paragraph can be a bolt that shears off under pressure. When she was gone, I made tea and sat at the table where Margaret and I used to plan our weeks. And I read the papers slowly until I found what I knew would be there. A durable power of attorney with the pharmacy clause tucked inside like a polite escort. My signature requested in 3 spots and a notary block already stamped with a date that had not yet arrived. The audacity of it frightened me in the way a sudden wind makes an old window rattle. Not because I feared the wind, but because I knew what time could do to wood. I put the papers back in the folder and slid it into the drawer with Margaret's recipes, where I could feel it near me, but not let it steal the whole room. The next morning, before the sun had burned the mist off the lawns, I walked to my bank and asked to speak to the manager I had known for years, a woman young enough to call me Mr. Clayton without irony and smart enough not to confuse courtesy with condescension. I told her I wanted text alerts on every transaction and a withdrawal limit that would require me to appear in person for anything over a modest sum. And I asked her to make sure no one, not even a daughter with the right last name and a confident stride, could change those settings without my signature beside hers on paper. She nodded gravely, as though blessing a man who had finally remembered to lock his doors at night, and when I left the bank I felt the small lift that comes when a person takes back a square of his own ground. That evening I opened the drawer, took out the folder, and wrote in a neat hand on the first page, "Declined by principal. No authority granted." I dated my refusal, signed it, and placed it back where she would find it, not to humiliate, but to make the boundary visible in ink. There were other small blows, the kind that redden but do not bleed, and together they bruised. At the grocer she managed to turn reaching for a jar on a high shelf into a public lesson about my limits, scolding me lightly in front of a pair of strangers who looked down at their carts as if they had accidentally overheard a quarrel in church. When I carried 2 bags to the car, she protested that I was pushing it, then stood back and let me load the trunk anyway so she could tell herself she had tried. And later in the driveway she announced, with the wild confidence of someone who has never missed a step in her life, that we would take the grandkids to the museum on Saturday and I could feel useful by treating them to lunch. I agreed, not because I needed to feel useful, but because I wanted one afternoon in which usefulness might be the cover story for something like love. The museum was housed in a dignified old building with stone steps that held the ghosts of a century of feet, and the day we went a fine mist had fallen that made every surface slick with a sheen you could mistake for polish. Claire arrived in a hurry, her heels clicking, her phone raised to capture a video of the children sprinting up the steps, and she flashed me a smile that looked almost girlish in the reflected light. "Careful," I said softly, more to the day than to anyone in particular. But she was already halfway up, narrating into her phone about family time and favorite exhibits and the importance of culture. I had just placed my foot on the first step when I saw her narrow heel skid on the wet stone, a quick sideways twitch that turned into a slip, that turned into the kind of fall a person does not believe is happening to them until they are already in it. It was not a dramatic tumble, no scream or flailing, just a sharp loss of grace and a drop to one knee that sent her phone skittering like a startled bird across the step, and the crack of plastic on stone brought a hush from the line of people behind us. For the briefest fraction of a second, I did nothing. Not out of malice, but because time itself seemed to pause and rehearse her own words in my ear. If he trips, just let him. He's old. He has to learn his limits. Then the pause passed, and I moved, not fast but steady. The cane set, my hand extended, my voice careful as if she were a child. She looked up at me with an expression that had never visited her face before, a mixture of embarrassment and rage, and a plea so small it barely formed. And I lifted her by the elbow as though retrieving some fragile thing from the floor. Her husband hovered, half ready to scold me for intervening and half relieved that I had. And the children stared with the particular intensity of the young when confronted with the sudden clumsiness of a parent who was meant to be invincible. Claire muttered that she was fine and shook off my hand, standing with too much energy, the way a person does when trying to prove to strangers that nothing has happened to their pride. Inside the museum, the air cooled our faces, and she walked ahead with a stiffness that had nothing to do with injury. During lunch in the cafe, she kept her sleeve tugged down to hide the scrape, and when her husband asked if she was sore, she snapped that the stairs were poorly maintained and someone should report it. Then she turned to me with a smile so tight it was almost a wince, and said that if I had been any slower, she would have been badly hurt. I took a breath that tasted of stale coffee and told her gently that my speed was the speed of a man who has learned caution, and that there was a difference between letting someone learn their limits and pushing them toward them. The children looked from her to me and back again, waiting to take their cue about what was funny and what was frightening, and for once Claire had no ready quip. She changed the subject to the new wing of modern art and announced we would all move on, as though the script had always read that way. Yet the stumble had unsettled something deeper than her balance. That evening, my phone lit up with a string of messages meant for other eyes, because technology, like conscience, sometimes forwards what should have remained private. A relative on her side had included me in a group text by accident, and I read how Claire framed the day as proof that I could not be trusted, that I had just watched while she fell, that it was honestly scary, and that we needed to accelerate decisions for my safety. The choice of verbs broke something small and essential in me. Watched, scary, accelerate. There it was again, the insistence that the only way to interpret my caution was as neglect, that my refusal to collapse on cue was itself a hazard to be managed. I deleted nothing. I took screenshots and printed them on my old inkjet printer that coughs through every page like an elderly friend climbing stairs, and I placed the pages in the same drawer with the folder I had already marked declined. If there was ever a moment to confront her, it came a few days later when she appeared without notice, the indignation of the righteous riding ahead of her like a banner. She wanted, she said, to clean up a few little things while she was here. The medication organizer, the spare keys, the pharmacy authorization, which she pretended to have forgotten I had refused. I led her to the kitchen and opened the drawer and showed her the folder with my handwriting on it and the pages with her messages, and I watched the way her eyes darted for a story that would protect her. She tried 3 at once. It was a misunderstanding. She had been venting. She was worried sick. I told her I believed she was worried, but that worry had twisted into something that resembled control more than care, and that I would not sign anything I had not read and understood in the full light of day. She said she did not recognize the man I had become, and I answered that I did not recognize the woman who could whisper, "Let him trip," like a stage direction. For a heartbeat, we stood like two people on a porch in a thunderstorm waiting to see if the lightning had struck a tree we could not yet see. News of our quarrel traveled faster than I would have believed possible for a family that barely speaks about anything that matters. And within a week, I was fielding calls from a cousin I had not heard from in years, and a neighbor who wondered if everything was all right, And when I told them it was, they offered the kind of advice that ends with "at your age," the way a prayer ends with "amen," as if the blessing were in the surrender. I smiled and thanked them, and then called my lawyer, a man who had buried 3 of his own clients last year and seemed to take his comfort from the fact that each of them left their papers in better order than their pantries. We met in the afternoon, and I told him I wanted 3 things: a living will that spared no one the responsibility of guessing, a medical proxy that named a neutral fiduciary rather than family, and a last testament that placed my house, my modest savings, and what little I owned into the hands of an outfit that stocked community pantries and fixed porches for veterans who could no longer climb ladders. He studied my face to make sure I was not acting from a sudden spite that would spoil with time, and I told him that I was not punishing my daughter, I was protecting my dignity, which is merely love for oneself after everyone else declines to tend it. He drew up drafts and I read them twice, lips moving like the old men I used to snicker at when I still believed old age was a costume you could remove at the door. And when I signed my name, I felt the surprising calm that follows a fever breaking. Walking home, I passed the park where the lilacs had already bloomed and gone, and I watched a young father lift his child onto his shoulders with that careless strength I can still conjure in memory, if not in muscle. I thought of the day in the museum and the tiny moral lurch I had felt when I hesitated, the pause that felt like justice more than revenge, and I decided that whatever people thought they saw that afternoon did not matter as much as what I knew. That love, even retired from active duty, retains the right to be proud. Still, the blows did not stop. Claire called the next week to announce she had scheduled a contractor to assess hazards in my house, an exercise that would likely result in removing my rugs, installing rails I did not need, and rearranging my furniture into a diagram that would make the place safer and less mine. I told her calmly that no one would come into my home without my say-so, and she replied with a brittle laugh that I was being stubborn, and that stubbornness was not a care plan. When I did not bend, she narrowed her strategy further, slipping remarks to the grandchildren about how forgetful I was, how I wandered, how I left burners on, a story that grows like mold in the corners of a family when daylight is scarce. The boy repeated it to me once without malice, just curiosity, and I told him I had installed stove knobs that click when the gas is off, and labels on every switch, not because I had to, but because habit is sometimes another name for craftsmanship. He nodded thoughtfully and asked if I could show him how I carved my cane, and that small recognition, that he saw a tool where his mother saw a crutch, felt like a match struck in a dark pantry, quick, bright, and enough to move forward. By then the days had lengthened into the heat of early summer, and the evenings had taken on the particular ache they always have for me, that hour when Margaret used to hum while she watered the roses and I swept the porch. Ritual chores that kept the world in order. I sat with the folder of papers near me, not because I wanted to gaze at my preparations like trophies, but because I needed to remind myself that even at 76, I could still choose the terms of my standing. It occurred to me, not with sadness, but with clean clarity, that the second escalation of this long, quiet war was not taking place in hospitals or banks or on wet stone steps, but in the territory of narrative itself. My daughter was trying to write me down to compress me into a set of deficits that justified her script, and I had decided politely and firmly to redact lines that did not belong to me. I would continue to answer the phone when it rang. I would say yes to museum outings if they can be done without commentary on my gait. I would buy ice cream and remember names and put my key on its hook by the door, but I would not sign away the right to be the author of my own last chapters. And if the next blow came, as I suspected it would, in the form of another staged kindness that would turn into evidence, then I would meet it with what I had kept all along, even when I could not find its name: the stubborn dignity of a man who refuses to fall on cue. I did not plan my answer as a spectacle. I am too old for theater and too tired for the kind of shouting that leaves a man shaking afterward. But the day it came to a head, I realized that a quiet man can still choose the room, the time, and the terms, sweet enough to soften even a hard heart. And I called Claire and told her I had found boxes of photographs I wanted to sort while the light was good, and would she bring the family by after church. She arrived crisp and punctual, her husband 2 paces behind, the grandchildren hanging back with the wariness of young people who sense trouble and don't yet know which side to stand on. And before anyone could announce a schedule or assign me a role, I gestured them toward the table, poured coffee into heavy mugs, and slid the pie between us like a treaty no one had yet read. The photographs lay in loose stacks. Margaret at 17 on a picnic blanket, Claire at 5 with frosting on her nose, me with an expression that now seems foreign, a kind of uncomplicated belief that time would keep circling back to the best days. If you met it at the door with good manners, and as my daughter reached for a picture of herself on a red bicycle, I placed a thin folder beside her plate and told her gently that before we looked backward, we had to look at what was right in front of us. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I simply slid the first page from the folder and read aloud the letter from the doctor who had tested me. The one who had said in precise sentences that my memory was sound, my judgment intact, my age appropriate for my years, and I watched the way Claire's jaw moved as she chewed nothing, the way her husband stared at the rim of his mug, as if there were instructions written there that might save him. Then I read the second page, the printout of the messages I was never meant to see, the ones that turned my hesitation on the museum steps into evidence, the ones that used words like watched and scary and accelerate decisions as if my life were a file that could be pushed across a desk and stamped with the right color to make it disappear. And when I had finished, I said her name quietly and told her I knew she had been worried. That worry is love's rough older brother, and often comes in first, but that worry without respect curdles into control, and control delivered as kindness is still control. She said the texts were taken out of context, that people say things they don't mean when they are frightened, that she had only been trying to keep me safe. And I nodded, because arguing with a frightened person hardens fear into righteousness. And then I took out the last page, the one with my lawyer's letterhead, and I said that to remove the burden from her shoulders, I had named a neutral healthcare proxy, arranged for automatic bill pay, placed small accounts in trust for the grandchildren, for one day when they might need first rent or first tuition or simply a first brave step, and left the rest, modest as it is, to the porch repair charity and the pantry that stocks the church basement on Thursdays, and that no power of attorney, durable or otherwise, would be requested or granted between us. She went very still at that, a stillness like glass that looks solid right until it shatters, and in the stillness her daughter, who had been paging through photographs as if they might offer a safer story, picked up the one of Claire at 8, kneeling in the dirt garden with Margaret, and asked me what we had been planting, and I told her beans and marigolds, because marigolds keep bad things away if you believe the old women at the market. And Claire said sharply, "We were not here to talk about flowers. We were here because I was being manipulated by strangers, because this was not me, because I had always done what was sensible, and what she was asking was sensible." And her voice rose with each sensible until it clipped at the ends, like wire. I set my mug down and said that what I was asking for was not permission to live recklessly, but permission to live deliberately. That a man ought to be allowed to choose a slower pace, even if it makes others anxious to watch. That falling is not a crime and standing back up is not a miracle. It is just what bodies and dignity do when given half a chance. Her husband cleared his throat and tried a conciliatory smile that did not reach his eyes, and suggested perhaps we could revisit the paperwork when emotions were not so high. And I nodded and said we could revisit coffee in 10 minutes, but the paperwork was finished, signed, filed, witnessed, and beyond the reach of mood. The room tightened like a belt a notch too far. Even the clock seemed to tick louder, as if volunteering to keep time for an argument none of us could graciously win. And I decided the kitchen was too small for breath, so I asked if anyone would like to bring the pie plates to the porch so we could sort photographs in the light. And I gathered the first stack and led them through the screen door into the afternoon, where the boards Margaret had insisted we oil every spring shone faintly, and the neighbor's maple cast a lace of shade at our feet. The grandchildren went first and sat side by side on the swing, as if it were a raft, and I held the door for Claire, and perhaps she was still inside her anger, or perhaps she forgot about the way the threshold lifts by half an inch where the house has settled. But her heel caught, and the plate she was carrying tipped, and a wet circle of pie slid onto the porch like a badge of clumsiness, and her body pitched forward in that undignified human way bodies have when gravity decides to interrupt a sentence. I do not know how many fractions of a second passed. It felt like 2 at most, 1 for memory and 1 for choice. But in that sliver, I heard her own whisper from the park, the one that had been rehearsing in my bones for weeks, and I also heard Margaret's voice as she used to speak to Claire when she was a child, tripping over her own laces. That soft, "I've got you," and I extended my hand and my cane at once. The wood braced, my palm steady, and I caught my daughter's forearm before the fall could bruise more than pride. Her eyes flicked up to mine with a look I had seen only once before, on the day she first left home with too many boxes and not enough patience. A look that said she did not know whether to cling or to strike. And I raised her gently to her feet and released her the moment her balance returned, because rescue without control was the only lesson I had the right to teach her anymore. A smear of apple and cinnamon darkened the porch. The grandchildren giggled and then grew solemn when they saw their mother's face, and the neighbor across the hedge pretended to be captivated by his hose, while watching us with the furtive attention of a man who has seen storms flatten fences in 5 minutes. I knelt with my own slow care, scooped the fallen pie with the broad knife I keep tucked under the planter because knives belong near kitchens, even outdoors. And as I carried the mess to the bin, Claire said my name in a voice that was almost the voice she had when she was small and calling to me from the end of the diving board. And I turned and waited, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone who lives by speed is to make them practice waiting. She said she had not meant the whisper at the river the way I heard it, that she had been scared and angry at the same time, that watching me move carefully felt like watching time take something from her, and that she had tried to get ahead of time by naming it and managing it. And now she could see that what she had been trying to control was not time, but me. And her eyes went shiny the way glass looks when the heat inside it wants to change shape. And for a moment, I felt the oldest ache a parent knows, the reflex to gather and forgive simply because she is yours. But then she said we could still fix this if I would just sign the form she had brought, if I would let her handle the errands and the prescriptions and the decisions. Not because she wanted power, but because she wanted peace. And in that pivot, the old cadence returned, the subtle click of the pen, no doubt waiting in her purse, the turn from confession to closing. And I understood that whatever floor we had reached by almost falling together was not a floor at all, but a landing on a stair she intended to climb. So I answered in the only way that would not place us back on the same treadmill, with a clarity that did not snarl and a tenderness that did not retreat. And I told her I was grateful she had said, even that much, that fear is not a flaw, but it is a Poor architect, that love must not outsource its plans to dread. And then I told her that I would not sign anything today or any day that transferred my choices to her, that I would see her and the children when the visit was a visit and not a mission, that I would gladly accept a ride to the grocery store and a laugh at the kitchen table, but I would not accept a clipboard disguised as affection. I reached into my pocket and drew out the small box I had prepared, a plain wooden thing I had sanded until it felt like a thought smoothed by repetition, and I placed it in her hand and asked her to open it, and inside lay the old rubber tip from the first cane I ever carved, cracked at the edge where I had misjudged a curb years ago, and on a slip of paper I had written in my neat block letters, "Limits are real, but they are mine to measure." She stared at it as if it were a relic, then as if it were an insult, and finally as if it were simply what it was, a reminder that even a small thing that has held a man up is worth more than paperwork that would take him down. The grandchildren came to stand beside her, one on each side, and the boy asked if he could have the photograph of the bicycle to keep in his room. And I said yes, and he tucked it carefully into his hoodie pocket as if it might crack. And the girl, braver than any of us, slid her hand through her mother's elbow and asked if we could eat the rest of the pie before the aunts did. And something in that simple request made us all laugh, even Claire, even me. And we cut the ragged circle into 4 and ate it off paper napkins in the porch shade, while the neighbor pretended not to be relieved that the weather had broken. When they left, Claire paused at the top of the steps, the same place she had almost fallen, and looked back at me as if memorizing a landmark. And I looked back not as a man bracing for the next blow, but as one who had finally placed his feet where they belonged, on boards he had oiled, in light he had chosen, carrying nothing he did not mean to carry. I did not tell her to be careful. I did not remind her about the threshold. I did not offer a speech. I simply stood and watched her navigate the descent on her own, balanced and a little slower. And when the car's engine turned over and moved away, the house exhaled, the clock returned to its ordinary ticking, and I stepped inside to wash the plates, my hands steady, the room mine. The afternoon arranged at last by dignity rather than fear. I did not wake the next morning expecting absolution or even quiet, only a house that sounded like itself again, and a mind that did not immediately rehearse an argument. And that modest wish, it turned out, was enough to begin a different kind of life, one that moved at the pace of coffee, cooling on the windowsill and the soft complaint of floorboards that have learned the weight and rhythm of a single man. In the days that followed the porch and the pie and the small wooden box with the old rubber tip, I made choices that would have looked unremarkable from the street but felt, inside my chest, like the return of a language I had once spoken without thinking and had somehow forgotten. So I walked to the bank and kept the alerts and limits I had set when fear first sharpened into caution. I visited my lawyer once more to make a small addition to the letter he had already typed and filed. No contact clauses around medical decisions. A list of neighbors and friends to call before. Any hospital would be allowed to hear a stranger's opinions about my mind. A quiet declaration that love is not a credential. And then I came home and opened every window as far as it would go and let the late light rinse the rooms the way Margaret used to when winter broke, and I understood with the kind of certainty that does not need witnesses that I had finished writing the chapter in which my daughter's worry was the narrator. I did not shut the door on her because a door, once slammed, has a way of remembering the slam and passing that memory to every hinge. But I did set a new rule. I could say without heat and keep without effort. If you come as a visitor. If you call as a daughter. If you bring papers, you keep them in your purse and we will have coffee instead. I wrote those limits plainly on an index card and taped it inside the cupboard where the mugs live, not as a warning to anyone else, but as a promise to myself that kindness must have edges or it bleeds away. And then I did the homely things that prove a house belongs to its occupant. I mended the screen door, sharpened the kitchen knives, planted a row of marigolds along the front walk because the old women at the market were right about their posture against bad company, and I took my cane out to the porch with a strip of sandpaper and tuned the handle to the shape my palm has taken these last years, approving that the wood and I had both learned to give a little. In the absence of campaigns and courtroom dates, my days arranged themselves like dominoes set with care rather than pushed with drama, and I found that the quiet held more than emptiness. There were the men at the VFW who told the same stories every Thursday and somehow made them new with a different detail. There was the boy next door who asked if I would show him how to oil a squeaky hinge and stayed to ask about the notch I had carved near the base of my cane. There was the librarian who had once watched me return all my books late after Margaret died, and now kept aside the new mysteries she thought would suit a man who had learned that clues do not always lead to culprits. Sometimes they just confirm what you already knew and were afraid to act upon. Weeks slid into a temperate season in which my phone did not ring as often as it used to, and when it did, I let it say my name twice before I answered. Claire left 2 messages in a voice that tried on contrition the way a person tries on a coat that might not be their color. She said she had been thinking. She said she missed the sound of me in a room, and once she simply said, "Dad," as if that word, spoken without argument, could restore the edges of its meaning. And I did not call back that day or the next, because it took me the better part of a lifetime to learn that answering immediately is not the same as answering well. When I finally did return the call, I said very little, and I said it slowly. I told her there was pie whenever she wanted pie, and that I would not be signing anything, not now, not later, and that any conversation we had would be about how the tomatoes were coming along, or whether the grandkids had found work that made them tired in a good way, or which hymn the choir had mangled last Sunday. And she was quiet for longer than I would have believed possible. And then she said she understood. And I said I hoped that one day she would not only understand but agree. And we left it there like a pair of shoes at the door waiting for weather. Some nights, when the house held more memory than air, I took out the small box with the cracked rubber tip and read the sentence I had written in my own hand. And I found that what had sounded like a line I wanted her to learn had in fact been a line I needed to carry. Limits are real, but they are mine to measure. A man old enough to keep time with his cane does not need a witness for that measurement. He needs only his own breath and the decency not to pretend that 3 steps are 2. The world did not improve on my account. It never does. But it did settle. Neighbors waved more often, and I waved back. I carried the heaviest bag for the widow 2 doors down, and in exchange, she gave me jars of pickled beets that stained my fingers and reminded me of the county fairs Margaret loved. And once, near the end of summer, I saw a man stumble on the park's uneven path where the roots blister the asphalt, and I reached him before he fell, because if the story granted me any authority at all, it was not the right to watch, but the duty to keep my hand extended. And when he thanked me, I said what I wish someone had said to me in another season. "You're fine. Take your time." That's all any of us are doing. It was perhaps 3 months after the day on the porch that a modest envelope arrived, with no return address, and the tilted handwriting of someone not yet practiced at adulthood. Inside there was a single page, and a pressed marigold taped like a grade school specimen, and a short note that did not waste words on applause or excuses. "Grandpa, I was on the steps the day at the museum. I heard what she said, and I also saw what you did. I'm sorry. I am learning not to be like that. Thank you for catching her, and for not letting any of us make that the story. And though there was no signature, I knew which grandchild had written it, because remorse rides differently in sons and daughters, and because the marigold, sturdy and common and bright, was the exact flower Margaret used to set at the edges of any place she wanted to protect. I did not reply because there was nowhere to send an answer, but I placed the page in the drawer with the photographs and the box and said her name aloud in an empty room that did not feel empty then, and I understood that truth, once spoken without malice, travels along family lines the way rain finds its level. By the time leaves began to gather in the gutters, my gait had not quickened, but my stride had deepened. And in the quiet of those late afternoons, I would sometimes think of the sentence that used to follow me like a mean dog, and I would see, with that small smile old men are allowed, that it no longer belonged to me at all. If someone should whisper again, "Let him trip, he's old," it would pass over my shoulder like a draft through a screen door. And if I should stumble, which I will describe the arc to myself and decide whether to reach for the rail or for the lesson. And I will stand again if I can and sit if I must, and neither posture will be a verdict, only a choice. On the last warm Sunday before the frost, I walked back to the park where the spring had cracked open my illusions, and I paused at the same root where the path rises and forgot to be smooth. The sun was weaker, the laughter quieter, the fountain tired, but I set my cane, took a breath, and stepped over. Not to prove anything, not to perform survival, but because the next bench had better light for reading, and the book in my pocket was at the place where a good man tells the truth to his child and then leaves the window open so she can come back when she learns what to do with it. And I thought, as I settled, that whatever else life had taken it had returned me to this exact privilege, to decide when I will move, to whom I will open the door, and how gently I will hold out my hand when gravity surprises someone I love.